Hello, everybody. For those of you who might remember, just over 2 years ago, when Shirley's debut adult novel came out, A Castle in Brooklyn, she and I had the pleasure to work together. My name is Rachel Tarlow Gull, and I have been very lucky to be the publicist for Shirley's adult novels. First, A Castle in Brooklyn, and now The Baker of Lost Memories, which just came out at the beginning of the week. The book has received some really, really great praise, including, I'm going to quote a couple. Today, there was a 5 out of 5-star review from the blog, The Fairy Review, that the blogger said she got lost in the memories and emotion that flowed off the page. Wachtel truly brings both characters and setting to life around the reader. Reviews from Historical Novels Review talk about the complexity of the main character, Lena's personality, and the effect of parental traumas are capably intertwined into a story that would make for a good book club discussion. Fresh Fiction talks about how the story moves seamlessly from Lena's parents' lives to Lena's, and they end the review by saying The Baker of Lost Memories is a heartfelt and moving story, and the reviews just continue: Bookishly Jewish, Midwest Book Review, Library Journal, Forward Reviews. It has been a pleasure and an honor to work with Shirley now for 2 years, and without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic over to her so she can tell you all about her latest book.
Thank you. Okay, can everybody hear me okay? No. Can you hear me okay now? Okay, good. Okay. Shut the mic. Okay, we're good? Okay, good. First of all, thank you so much, Rachel, for that beautiful introduction. Rachel is my publicist, and truly, if it weren't for her, the book would not get into so many hands. And I'm really indebted for that because Rachel leaves me the time to do the easy stuff, which is just to write. So thank you for that. And I also want to thank the East Brunswick Library and Melissa Hosick for having me today. This has been and always has been a very special place for me and for my family. Many days, many evenings I've spent here, and my children have spent here. And of course, what could be bad? It's a library. You're surrounded by books, one of my favorite places to be. Since I'm giving thanks out, I really want to thank Eve Adderman. She's not here today. She's on maternity leave. But she's my agent at William Morris and responsible for getting my books into the very adept, very wonderful hands of Carmen Johnson, who's my editor at Little A. So I really thank them. There are other people I want to thank, and that is, first of all, my family, my children, Howie, Brad, and Charlie, and they're taking the photos now. Howie and Brad are here. And of course, my out of this world, terrific grandchildren, Zoe and Emmy and Stella. So thank you for them, because truly they remain my inspiration. Also, my brother Jack, who's been through it all with me and knows the whole story from, 5 years after I was here. And my wonderful sister-in-law, Emily, who's always one of the first to read my books. And my good friends, many of you I've acknowledged in the book, who are always there for me. Many are lifelong friends, and I'm really indebted to you, and I love you all. But at the very top is this guy who's by my side for everything, and I couldn't write a word without him, whether he believes me or not, and that's my husband, Arthur. So thank you, thank you. So my final thanks, of course, goes to all my readers who pick up the book and have seen something in this book. And my other book, and things I wrote before this as well. But I really want to apologize because I'm going to begin with some stories, and some of you have heard these stories before. So if you have, just please bear with me. And those are the stories of my parents who were Holocaust survivors. And the reason I think it's so important to let you know a little bit of this background is that they really were the impetus for my writing. I knew from when I was a little child that I always had a story to tell. And obviously, as a writer, writers tell their own stories, whether it seems like that or not. Yes, it's fiction, but there's always a little bit of truth in that. So I'll tell you what happened to my parents, and then I'll tell you why it's been so important for me to acknowledge these stories. So my father was in the Lodz ghetto. He was a young man, and he had sisters and brothers, 5, and a mother, and when the war broke out. And he was in the Lodz ghetto, which, as many of you know, it was kind of like a prison. You know, the town there were gates, there was like a prison. And food was very hard to come by. And I learned in later years that my father was a runner for the black market, which meant that he took great risks and got on trains. He was a small man, but he was a very fast man, very quick. And he would run and get people all the necessary things that they needed, the foods that they needed, so that they could survive, because the rations they had were not enough to survive by. When the ghetto was dispersed, he was going to go to Auschwitz. And many of you are familiar with the selections. You know, the Dr. Mengele and the others, they would look at you and they would say, right, left, right, left. And if you went to one line, well, then you would become a worker. Not that life was so great, but it was still life. If you went to the other line, then it was for the gas chamber. And seeing that my father was, at the time, you know, small man, skinny man, he'd been starved, of course, they put him to the line for the gas. But he was smart, and he ran when their eyes were averted. He ran to the line for life. And I always say, if not for that simple, quick action on his part, I wouldn't be here today, my children wouldn't be here today, my grandchildren wouldn't be here today. So that was my father's story. And I will say that as a young child, of course, you know, you don't really know the full extent of what your parents have gone through. I don't know if anybody really does, but I couldn't understand why we'd be walking down the street in Brooklyn and strangers would come up to my dad and hug him and kiss him and say, thank you for saving my life. So that was a little puzzling to me, but now I realize what it was for. My mother was one of 8. She was the first one taken from her home. She actually was working in a bakery for her aunt. Maybe that's why I got the idea of the bakery. And she was coming home with some rolls from the bakery, and a car stopped. Gestapo got out, grabbed her from the street. She saw her mother at the door. She never saw her mother again. And she was taken to a work camp. At the time, there were, the gas chambers were just starting up. So she was lucky, and she was even luckier because she met one of the guards, Gisela. And my mother used to talk about Gisela, even at the end of her life, saying, Gisela was my angel. She wasn't a Jewish woman. She was a guard. But yet she said to my mother, I will teach you to sew, because, you had to work. That saved your life. I will teach you to sew, and you will, in this way, you'll survive. And would sneak my mother bread. You will be my daughter here, she said to her. And at the end of my mother's life, she would always say, why did she choose me? There were other young girls there. Why did she choose me? And, she remembered that, and she was always indebted to her. And I think that's, one of the reasons why my parents never bore any ill will towards others who were different. They were victims. A lot of victims easily could have been bitter, but my parents were not, because it was a woman, she was Catholic, who saved my mother's life. And also because they were victims, and they knew in their hearts that they couldn't victimize other people, no matter what they looked like, no matter where they worshiped. So after my mother survived that, she went on a death march, ended up in Bergen-Belsen, and met my aunt there. And then they were liberated. And she met my father. They were a setup in the displacement camp. But at the end of the war, she lost her parents, gone, not even a grave to visit. She lost her parents, she lost her brothers and sisters, whom she, of course, loved dearly. And what remained was an older brother, Victor, and his wife, the one she met at Bergen-Belsen. And their two children children didn't have a chance. And they ended up, after the war, they had another child, and that's my cousin, Mark. She had Victor, an older brother, and Carl, a younger brother. And Victor and Carl went on to have two children and a whole bunch of grandchildren and now great-grandchildren, although they have passed away since then. So that's what I grew up with. I never had a photo even of a grandparent, okay? I have one photo of my mother and her sisters before the war, but that's it. So knowing this, as I say, I never grew up with fairy tales. The good fairy was Gisela, the woman who saved my mother, and the big bad wolf was Hitler, of course. So those are the stories I grew up with. And I knew that I was different somehow from many, many of my Americana friends. And with that knowledge, I think, came an obligation on my part, because I realized that life was so very precious, and that I couldn't take my life for granted, and I had to do something with my life. And so for me, that something was writing. And so I've always written, and my parents have been the subject of many of these stories. And I think as a parent, I say that something was writing, but also as a parent, that is a way of giving back. That is a way of ensuring the future. And I think in some way, I know that my sons have inherited this sense of obligation to do something with their lives. And I believe, let me just say, a couple of weeks ago, I attended my granddaughter Zoe's bat mitzvah. And Rabbi called us up, the grandparents, and we passed the Torah on to my son and my daughter-in-law, who then passed it on to their daughter Zoe. And that was so very meaningful for me, for us, because, normally we think of children want to kind of make a distance between themselves and their parents, and grandchildren too. And that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to go out and fly. But yet, those bonds, whether they know it or not, will always be there. And I'm so proud of the bonds that my parents have given me, which we have given to our children, which they in turn give to their children. And that's what makes life meaningful. So I want to talk about, this brings us to the subject of my book. And by the way, I'm going to try not to give too much away here. The character of Joseph, those of you who have read it already, you might already know that Joseph is modeled after my father, because in the book, Joseph is a runner from the black market, so it didn't just, come out of my head. But that was my father's story. So, as children, we all inherit things from our parents. Now, it's not always as simple as the color of your eyes or how tall you're going to be. There are things we inherit that I think many of us aren't even aware that we inherit these things. And I will say, certainly in my case, I was aware of things, but I chose to look at the positive. There's so much negative, and I inherited a lot of negative too. But I choose to look at the positive. I choose to think that my parents survived for a reason. I choose to think that everything will come out okay. And at the end of my books, every book that I write, truly, everything does come out okay. And that's the way I look at the world. And I think I get that from my parents because they were very positive. They could have been bitter. They could have stayed in a hovel, and not gone on. But they wanted to make something of their lives. America was the land of their dreams. And my father went on to own a business. My mother was always at his side working at that business. And yes, today, it's very hard to believe in the dream of America. A lot of things going on in this country. And sure, we need to criticize those things, but I think we still have to believe in the promise of America. So I get that from them. I hope I get the empathy. My mother had a lot of empathy. Children who didn't even know her would run up to her because they sensed that there was something about her character. I think I get my determination from them to keep on no matter the odds. I intended to publish my first book when I was in my 20s, and here I am, right? So it took a while, but I never wanted to give up on my dream. Now, the other side of the coin is I got a lot of fears from my parents, sometimes the mind goes to the worst. You know, when it's a health issue, I can't be talked to, Fears about the world, sure, that's part of it. And, even though I choose to look at one side of the coin and not the other is there too. And as many Holocaust survivors, the children of Holocaust survivors do, we feel this obligation to always protect our parents, never tell them anything that's bad. Like the time when my Uncle Victor died, and he was older already, and didn't tell my mother that he was sick, didn't tell my mother that, her brother was so ill or anything like that. We wanted to protect her. So in the character of Lena, we see someone who's a child of survivors, but it doesn't seem like she's inherited much good from it. Even though she has a warm bed to sleep in, she has food every evening for dinner, Her parents are trying to give her everything, but yet she senses that hole, and the hole was left by a sister that she never knew. She had heard a little bit about this sister. She had heard that the sister worked in her parents' bakery. And she saw that sometimes her mother would cry. Sometimes her father would look at the mother. Joseph would look at Anya, and they thought it was a look shared between the two of them. But, children can sense these things. And so Lena grows up as a child who is really, I would say, depressed, really alone, and she is looking for someone to fill that hole, because she's afraid to be her true self with her parents. She wants to protect them. She doesn't want them to know how she really feels. And so she tries to take the place of her dead sister. She tries to become Ruby. And it's something that she feels she's continually failing at. She seeks solace through a friend, her friend Pearl. Pearl is much needed because she can't confide in anyone else. When she marries, she's hoping that her husband, Luke, will be the one that she can fully confide in, but somehow it doesn't work out that way. And I think only when she comes to terms with this, with her family, does she find some kind of a resolution. So here we see something that is really intergenerational trauma, things we don't think about that we pass on, not willingly, not voluntarily, but we do pass these things on to our children. So I would like to read a small portion of the book. This happens when Lena is a child, and she's baked a honey cake. She comes home, it's going to be a big surprise for her mother. She's baked a honey cake, and she wants to show that she's just as good a baker as their first daughter was. And this is what she's met with. I thought I smelled my honey cake, Anya said, walking over to the loaf and giving it a poke with her finger, then suddenly turning toward her daughter. Lena, was this you? You did this? Lena felt a heat rise through her face. Unable to speak, all she could do was nod. She watched as her mother poked the loaf with her index finger. and picked off some of the raisin eyes before looking over at Lena again. "You make this?" she repeated. "Yes, Ma, I made the honey cake." "How you make?" Lena felt as if she were being grilled like one of those criminals she had seen on a police show she watched on TV. "How you know to make such a cake?" Lena shrugged, her gaze unwavering. "From you, I learned how to bake by watching you." An air of confusion floated across Lena's face, and it seemed as if she had removed a mask as she gave a little shudder, as if she were remembering something. She took off her trench coat and went into the living room to join Joseph. Before long, Lena heard the two speaking their mixture of Yiddish and Polish in hushed tones. She remained immobile in her seat, ignoring the unwashed dishes, even the honey cake she had worked so hard on, which had looked so festive only a couple of hours ago, and now appeared somewhat sad and pathetic. She thought of going into the living room, interrupting their conversation, but instead she got up, brushed off the thin coating of flour dust that still clung to her hands, and walked over to the counter where the cake sagged in the pan. Still looking up at her, no longer needing the towel, she picked up the metal pan with her bare hand. Then, standing over the garbage pail in the corner of the kitchen, Lena shook the tin and watched as the sides of the cake slowly separated from the metal and broke into pieces as it descended to the bottom. I'm going to read a short excerpt that comes shortly after this. Okay, at this point, right after this happens, the incident with the cake, Lena is thinking, she's in the bath, and she's thinking about everything, about what just happened. And her mother had just said to her the following: "Lena, you worry, you are too young for this. Your daddy and I have always had worry, but you, Lena, you are the luckiest girl in the world." Lena closed her eyes, tried to take in the truth of her mother's words. She was only 10. She had her whole life ahead of her, full of possibilities. She lifted one hand out of the water and examined the lines in the palm. She realized then that a part of her wanted to remain, to stay in the bath forever and never leave. Because if she stayed, she would be whatever she wanted: a famous singer on the stage, the first woman in space, or a baker with her very own shop. Lena closed her eyes and listened. She was grateful that she could no longer hear her parents' voices down the hall, only the drip of the leaky faucet. And again, she wished she could stay in the safety of the bath, but already the heat vapors in the air had begun to vanish as the water cooled. But when she opened her eyes, she knew she couldn't stay, that she would have to leave the tub, the room, and go back to her hopeless life. A life where she wasn't the luckiest girl in the world, only a girl with a dead sister who would always come first. Thank you. Okay, so I think I'll open it up to questions.
Hi, Shirley. I just have one question. I didn't read your book. I am going to buy it right afterwards. I'm going to read it immediately. But I'm just curious as to what other metaphors you had for baking. I mean, was it a metaphor, or was it really actual things where people were working in bakery? I know you just read us something where she baked something for her family, and it and the consequences of which should have been positive obviously weren't. What other metaphors were there?
Well, I think the metaphor of baking, is pretty obvious because, we all love to go into a bakery. Most of us love to have sweets. We have them over here for people. And because please eat them, because I don't want to bring them back home. And so, I think that's the main metaphor in the book. But of course, there are others, but I don't want to give too much away. I don't want to give, because there's stuff at the end that happens.
Did your parents speak openly of their experiences?
Yeah, they did, especially my father. And I'm really grateful for that. My Uncle Carl, my brother knows this very well, my Uncle Carl never wanted to speak of it. You know, he said, and in fact, my mother, you know, the Shoah Foundation, Steven Spielberg had survivors testify, give their testimonies. And my mother wanted to testify, and she did towards the end of her life. It wasn't very, it wasn't the best testimony because she had Alzheimer's and forgot a lot at that time. But my Uncle Carl, who, he did not want her to speak. He said, your mother's very fragile. You know, we don't talk about these things. So I'm really lucky that they did speak. And in fact, one time my mother was at a Hadassah meeting, and there was a speaker there talking about the Holocaust. And she mentioned to the woman, she was in the audience, she mentioned to the woman next to her, she said, yeah, I survived the war. And all of a sudden, there was a crowd of people around her. And when my mother returned home, she called me and she said, who am I? I'm just an ordinary person. But she didn't understand that what had happened to her was so extraordinary, and so was her survival. So I'm lucky that they did speak, yeah.
Shirley, did you mention what happened to your father's family?
Well, my father his father passed away. My father used to say before the war. So my father used to say he died like a king because he died in peace. And ironically, my father passed away in bed the same way, you know, in 1983. The rest, there were cousins, there were aunts and uncles. Five. And actually, at the end of the war, he found out that there was a sister alive, his youngest sister. My parents used to tell me, oh, you look a lot like, well, my father did. My mother didn't know her. My father said, you look a lot like my youngest sister. And I wished I had a picture of her, you know? And I always imagined how she might look. And he went to see her. She was in a hospital in Paris. She had food poisoning. And the moment he got there, 2 moments earlier, she passed away. Not only that, at the end of the war, he went back to his home in Lodz, looking for something, for some memento of his family. And he found something. And it was one picture, one photograph. And it was of himself. So talk about irony, right? Yeah, he was truly, and you know, when you're alone like that, when you lose everyone, there's a lot of baggage that comes with that. You know, my father was, he was sometimes angry, sometimes very emotional. He was very jealous, I'll tell you that. He was very jealous. My mother looked at someone and the green monster came out, but we understood that because we were all that he had. Yeah.
I had a question about your research process. So a lot of this is obviously family history, but did you go back, for instance, to Lodz or like, oh, no?
I did not go there. I did not go there. I don't know. I know people who were writers who go back to the homes, and I know my aunt and my cousin, my aunt who was married to my Uncle Victor, my dear Aunt Wachtel, went back to her home with her son. This was during the 60s, 70s, and no, my parents didn't want to go back, and I never went back. So a lot of my research was just research, you know, looking at books, looking at other people's writing. And when I was going for my doctorate at Drew, I did a formal research project, and it was second generation in middle age. And I know there are a couple of people here whom I interviewed, and that's people like myself, and what things we had in common. And it was really very psychologically eye-opening for me, because, things like we all value education. We value the state of Israel. We value religion, and above all, we value the next generation, our children, And we also had some of the same fears too. So, no, I didn't go back and visit.
This is a personal question for me. Do you speak Yiddish? Because I know in my family, they would only speak Yiddish when they didn't want the children to understand what they were talking about.
Okay. Actually, Yiddish was my first language. Believe it or not, I spoke Yiddish before I spoke English. I learned English from TV and on the streets. My mother learned it from neighbors. My father went to school to learn English, okay? However, and where's my brother Jack? Ich kann nicht reden, als I get. He knows that. We both understood, my parents spoke Yiddish all the time. If they didn't want us to understand something, although we understood some of the curse words, right, Jack? If they didn't want us to understand something, they spoke in Polish, but they spoke almost all the time in Yiddish. But my mother read the foreword a lot. She was very proud of learning English that way, which actually you see with my characters, especially, with Anya, who learns by reading and looking at the news. Yeah. Any other questions? I will say something. Nobody asked me about another character who plays an important role in the book, and that's Luke. Luke is the boy she ends up marrying. And so Luke actually came from a little bit of my experience. When I was going to Brooklyn College, yes, I went to Brooklyn College. That was, Brooklyn College figures in much of my writing. And I had an 8 a.m. class. It was a class in philosophy. And I was on the bus, and a young guy came up to me. And he did not look like anybody I would have gone out with that I met at one of the dances at the temple. No. He didn't look at all like that. He was roguish looking. He had long hair, long dark hair, beautiful eyes. And he approached me. And, he was a little bit dangerous looking, which is kind of always the best kind, right? And we had a very nice conversation. I can't really remember what that was about. And at the end of the conversation, he asked for my number. And I hesitated a minute. Was this somebody, he was a hippie, really. Was this somebody for me? And I wrote the number, but it wasn't mine. So I often, would think about that. How would my life have turned out? I'm glad I wrote that phony number today. Those of you who've read the book know that that's what happens with Lena, and she gives him her real number, and then, her life takes off in this direction. But I think I made a pretty good choice instead of
We have a question in the chat.
Yes.
This question is your husband RT's favorite book? Is this his favorite book? I think this might be a plant because there's a recognizable last name.
I think Howie wrote that.
He said a lot of books
that
she wrote are his favorites. So I think there's
he really has read my books. So kudos.
in the dress.
Okay. I thank you all very much for coming out. Thank you.